So good night. Hello, everybody. I am Barbara Brown, Clinical Director of Redbird Therapy, and we are primarily located in Toronto, Ontario. And we are so happy to be hosting this series called Private Practice Essentials. And we have an incredible lineup of 5 workshops over this winter term. And so we hope you will check them all out. Tonight, we are really excited to be having Liane Wood. She and I have been colleagues for a number of years, and I have attended many of Liane's trainings. She's smart, she's funny, and she's super grounded in the material we really need to know as psychotherapists. So Liane will tell you a bit more about herself. And as we go through tonight, there will be a time right at the end for Q&A. So if you can hold off on your questions till then, that's great. Feel free to put them up in the chat box. We might be able to address some of them as we go, but we will do the very best we can. And one quick reminder, we are recording tonight. So if you have something that you want to check out that is a little bit more personal or vulnerable, you may want to just touch base with myself or Liane at the end by email rather than have it directly on the recording. So I'm going to hand this over to Liane. Thank you so much for being here and helping us learn about CRPO standards and feel some degree of confidence. You know, for many people, CRPO and confidence are not words that go together. So I am really happy about hearing what you have to say tonight.
Oh, thank you, Barbara. And I am excited to be here tonight with all of you. So I want to, say a huge welcome to you. So welcome. My name is Liane Wood. I am a registered psychotherapist. I'm a private practice owner with a group practice in Belleville, Ontario. I'm also a clinical supervisor, and I am Was I muted that whole time?
You just got muted accidentally when I was trying to mute people coming in. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. I was like, oh no, do I need to start over?
You can start over.
You want me to start over? I can start over.
Start over.
What did I say?
I love technology.
Oh, this is fun. I love it. I love it. Okay. Well, welcome again, everybody. My name is Liane Wood. I am a registered psychotherapist. I have a private practice, group practice in Belleville, Ontario. I'm a clinical supervisor, and I am also the Chief Empowering Officer, CEO of Build Your Private Practice, Inc. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to cover really the key points of what needs to be included in your clinical documentation. So each of you can be thinking of what you're doing in your practices now. You can identify any gaps and then start to create a plan to address the things that you feel need your attention. And it's not going to be difficult. We're going to be okay going through all of this together, okay? So just real quick, there's a copyright notice there. And then I'm just going to jump right into some things here. So, this webinar is really based on my own professional experiences and my own knowledge. And I'm sharing with you what has worked for me. So I frequently consult with others, and I also end up making a number of educated guesses because there's so very little that's been published here in Canada on the topic of clinical documentation. So I want to encourage each one of you to do your own research, do some consults on your own, and really, take away from today what fits for you, and then modify or leave the things that don't. So for an overview of what we're going to be covering tonight, we're going to be looking, talking about clinical documentation, and we're going to be looking specifically at CRPO's document titled the Record Keeping Practices or the Clinical Records Checklist. And if I can find my chat box here, and I figured it was going to come right up on my screen share, I'm just going to put the link in the chat right now to that clinical records checklist. You may or may not want to have that open in another tab on your computer. So we're just going to be going through each of the sections of that checklist in detail. And then at the end, we're going to be wrapping up by looking at what needs to be included on invoicing and receipts for service, okay? And I know that like clinical documentation is a topic that many psychotherapists both loathe and dread. So I really want to take a moment right now to acknowledge each one of you for your bravery in attending this seminar. I think if you're here for this topic, that you're showing both an interest in and a commitment to making sure that your documentation is high quality. And the last thing that I want for any of you is for you to become overwhelmed by the information being presented here. So, right from the very beginning, I want to tell you that I think it's an unrealistic expectation to think that anyone is going to leave this seminar tonight and be able to implement everything that we're going to discuss in their practice by tomorrow morning. So, just put that idea out of your head right now. When I started the process of working on my own clinical documentation in my practice, I spent a solid 12 months gradually integrating and shifting my procedures to get my documentation to where I think it needs to be. My practice was workable before I took on the task of improving my clinical documentation. And I mention this because I think it's highly likely that your practices right now are workable exactly the way they are. So there's no need to panic and think that everything relating to your documentation needs to be changed right now. Rightly or wrongly, there is a perception, mostly by third-party payers, if you think like insurance companies, that type of thing, where they think that high quality documentation equals high quality therapy. And I do not think this is necessarily true. I think that clinical documentation isn't taught in our psychotherapy training programs. And so while we may be great therapists, it doesn't always show up in how we document what we're doing. And when I think back, way back to some of my high school math classes, I can recall being able to solve math problems and get the right answer. But where I struggled with, or what I struggled with, was being able to explain or show my work, to show how I went from the question or the problem to the solution. And clinical documentation is all about explaining your work. This is not at all about changing how you do therapy with your clients. Clinical documentation is about explaining your work, okay? So before we're finished this seminar, I will give you my thoughts on how to prioritize any changes to your own clinical documentation that you may want to make. Where to start, and how to work your way through your practice over time to move through each area and section of clinical documentation. Now, because we only have a short time together this evening, I hope you understand that we don't have time to go into things like how to write session notes or how to write a treatment plan or discharge summary. Many things like these topics would be at least an hour-long seminar on their own. So let's jump right into that clinical records checklist from CRPO. And you'll notice at the top that it starts with the client profile. And so it talks about the information that needs to be included, the client's full name, date of birth, their address and contact information, think phone number, email address, a unique identifier if it's applicable. Some electronic health record systems like Jane, Owl, those types of systems actually assign client numbers to client profiles, and then relevant information about the client's substitute decision maker if that's applicable. And then it goes into how the client was referred to you. You need to have that in the client profile. If it was if they were referred by a professional, we should have that professional's name and contact information and the reason for the referral, or note on the client profile that the client was self-referred. If you refer a client to another professional or service, we should be noting the name of the professional in the service and the reason that you referred the client. So most of most of the things in this section is really pretty straightforward. I know that the part that caught me by surprise here the very first time I read this, and other therapists that I've talked to also caught them by surprise, was noting how each and every client was referred to me. And so if that's a little bit of a surprise to you, if you've been missing noting how new clients come to your practice up until now, don't lose sleep over this, okay? My suggestion is to add it to your process with new clients, to simply ask them, how did you find me? Right? And then capture their answer. You can do this on a go forward basis and don't stress about the clients you've been working with for years. And here's why I'm suggesting doing it this way. Most of you have not been audited by CRPO yet, and making a change like this now on a go forward basis, if you are audited, you can demonstrate that you took the initiative to make changes to your documentation, and you can show that you've been consistent in capturing this information from the point in time you became aware your files were missing it. And most of the time, that's going to cover you in a records audit. Now, if you've been missing one of the other items in this section, my suggestion would be for you to consider choosing a date, whether it's tomorrow or sometime in the near future, where you begin to ask each client for the missing information. If it was my practice, I would be looking at the client profiles before each session and then making a note of what information I was missing, and then ask the client for the information in the session, and then make notes to complete the profile. And I would suggest doing this with all of your active and current clients. The next section on the checklist is the record document. And so it talks about here our client records. And so they need to be legible. And that means not just readable by you, but also readable by other people. And they need to be able to understand what's written in the record. And this usually isn't a problem if your records are typed or electronic. Entries in the record need to appear in chronological order. That means in date order. So, and each entry in the record needs to be dated and signed or initialed by you. If it's an electronic record, the original entry needs to be visible or retrievable. And then continuing on, the record needs to contain notation of all client encounters, whether it's in person, telephone, email, web-based text messages, that all of it needs to be captured and noted in the record. And you should also have a list of client reports that are sent to you or received by you. And then references to additional records if the record is stored outside of the clinical record. So most of this section is also pretty straightforward. If you are using an electronic health record system, your record will check off a number of the requirements in this section. So, when I say electronic health record system, I'm talking about systems like OWL, Jane, New Talk. There's all kinds of them out there. So anything that's electronic that is Canadian in particular should be checking off a number of the requirements in this section, such as, being legible, being in chronological order, being dated and signed, and noting changes to the record while also keeping the original entry visible and retrievable. Now, if you're using a physical filing system, like a paper filing system, you can see by reading through this checklist that it's pretty important to keep your paper files orderly. And this section of the checklist gives you some good guidelines for how to organize a physical file. So whether an EHR system or a physical filing system, you can see that staying up to date on your notes is really important, as it helps you keep on top of what's happening and reduces your feelings of being overwhelmed with documentation. It can also give you confidence that your files are in good order. The big item in this section that I think has a high probability of being missed by psychotherapists is that requirement for noting all client encounters. I think this is an area where there could be a lot of debate about what to include and what not to include. I've heard from several people that we aren't expected to record communications around scheduling sessions, and I think that probably makes sense. And, personally, I choose to err really on the side of caution when, I'm reading on there that all client encounters need to be documented. I tend to think that all means all. So think about that as you're, communicating with your clients outside of session. I use an EHR system, and I find that documenting client encounters outside of sessions is really pretty straightforward. I can drag and drop emails into my clients' charts. For text messages, I'll do a screenshot of the messages and then upload them into the client's chart. And then for phone messages or conversations, I just write a quick summary of that message or conversation in the client's chart. If I was using a physical paper filing system, I would print off those emails. I would still screenshot the text messages and put them into a Word document and then print the Word document off. And then again, for phone conversations or messages, writing a quick summary and then putting all of that into the client file. So for implementing changes in your practice relating to this section, you can consider the following. If you're using an electronic health record system and you haven't been electronically signing your session notes, you may want to pick a time in the next couple of months to figure out how to find all of your unsigned notes. So there should be like a report section that you can go into in your electronic health record and do a search for unsigned chart entries. And then you can start going through them and signing them. If you have physical files, you could either go through each active client file as you have sessions and make sure the file is in order, or you could decide to set aside some time to work your way through your files and make sure that they're all in order with all the necessary pieces in place. It's completely up to you what you think will work best for you. Now, if you haven't been noting all of your client encounters, I think it's really highly unlikely that you'd be able to accurately go back in time and capture all of them. So instead of trying to do that and beating yourself up about it, just make a commitment to begin noting all client encounters and communications and start doing this right away, right? Because the sooner the better for this one. So make a commitment to do that as soon as you can, and do that on a go forward basis. All right. So now I'm going to jump into the therapeutic process section of the clinical records checklist. So we're talking about documenting the therapeutic process, and it needs to include the following. Our documents need to show the informed consent process for initial services, recording explicit and implied consent, the process of obtaining ongoing informed consent and whether it's explicit or implied. Therapeutic assessments, including assessment methods, findings, observations, and professional opinions. Risk assessment, both initial and ongoing. Informed consent and ongoing consent. And this includes your initial consent form for services, which is considered explicit consent. Verbal consent is only considered explicit if you put it in your notes. Implied consent for therapy is inferred. So, the client showing up for sessions is implied consent. They're there. They're showing up for the session. So in all cases of explicit and implicit consent, we need to note that. Whenever you're introducing a new modality or anything else new in therapy, ask for and record consent. Then there's the topic of assessment. So there may be some of you who don't use formal assessments like the GAD-7 or the PHQ-9. And if you do use those assessments and others that are similar, they need to be noted in the client file. If you don't use formal structured assessments, don't worry. You may not realize it, but you are still assessing your clients in sessions as a therapist. And one of the easiest assessments that is non-invasive is something called an embedded mental status exam. Clients don't even realize it's happening, and you can use it to fulfill this requirement on the checklist of assessments. So a mental status exam notes whether the client is aware of who they are, where they are, and if they are aware of times, such as the time of day, time of year, the day of the week, or the month in the year. So it's three things. It's who, where, and when. So as a client is talking, if they were to say something like, yesterday I went to the gas station by my house and I saw my neighbor. That sentence is a pass for an embedded mental status exam. They're identifying themselves and the neighbor, that's both who. Gas station by my house is where, and yesterday is when. Okay, so you can do it really, really easily just by observing and listening to your client. If you think that your client is having difficulty in that area, you can ask them questions like, what day of the week is it again? Or what are your child's names or your kids' names, or what's your address? And now you have a bit more of a formal mental status exam where you're asking specific questions around who, where, and when. Please don't make this assessment section of the clinical record checklist harder on yourself than it needs to be. If you're using formal assessments, note those, okay? And if you haven't been using formal assessments, you don't have to, but find something like an embedded mental status exam that can be done easily and noted in your file to cover yourself in this area for clinical records. The second part to this is documenting risk assessment. So risk assessment is for things like suicidality, self-harm, assault, and homicide. Risk assessment is not a once and done assessment. It's ongoing throughout the course of therapy, and it needs to be documented when you assess your client. If in a session you don't see any risk factors for suicidality, self-harm, assault, or homicide, a simple statement in your notes that says no significant risk factors noted demonstrates you are watching and listening for risk factors. It's really important to say here that when it comes to things like consent and risk assessment, CRPO's position on this is that if it's not documented, their assumption is it didn't happen. Okay, so think about that. Their assumption is if it's not in your notes, it didn't happen when it comes to consent and risk assessment. So, seeing as consent and assessment are required, we need to document it. And, unfortunately, if you go through the discipline section on the CRPO website, there have been some challenges and some issues for therapists around the area of, working with suicidal clients. And so, I make sure myself to note risk assessment on every single session note. And again, right, if there are no signs, there's no signs that this person is suicidal or they're going to harm themselves or somebody else, then I make that note that there's no risk factors, no significant risk factors present. And that in and of itself indicates that I was thinking about risk assessment while I was speaking with the client and while I was in session. Okay, so treatment plan. Both the CRPO standard for clinical documentation and the clinical records checklist call this a therapy plan or a plan for therapy. And because it didn't say treatment plan, I was unclear if this meant something else when I first read it. And so I reached out to CRPO's practice advisory a few years ago, specifically to find out what this meant. And they responded by telling me that they do expect a treatment plan in every client file. So that's, one thing on there. Continuing on in the therapeutic process, notes about changes to the treatment plan or direction for therapy need to be on there. The client's informed consent for changes to the direction for therapy or therapy plan. That treatment plan is a big one, especially if you haven't been doing them. If you're already doing them, that's great. If you haven't, this one is going to take some time. I know it did for me, getting treatment plans into all of my client files. And I firmly believe in starting things in a manageable way, because if it's not manageable, I know for me, I'm not likely to do it if it's not manageable. And so I would suggest, if you have not been using treatment plans in your clinical documentation, to start yourself off with very simple treatment plans that include identifying 2 or 3 problems that your client wants to work on. Things like, maybe worrying and ruminating thoughts. And then list the client's goals for each problem. So we could say, reduce or stop worrying and ruminating thoughts. And then come up with an objective. That's what the client will do, like learn CBT skills for anxiety. That could be an objective. The next piece in a treatment plan would be an intervention, which is what the therapist will do. So if the client is going to learn CBT skills for anxiety, then the intervention, what you will do, might be something like teach CBT for anxiety skills. And then end your treatment plan with therapeutic outcomes, which is really about identifying the benefits for clients as a result of therapy. So an outcome in this case might be like the client will learn new skills to reduce worrying and ruminating thoughts, which will improve daily functioning abilities. You really begin by deciding to create simple treatment plans for any new clients that you take on as of a specific date. And then once you're comfortable with that, once you've done that for a short time, maybe a month, start going through your active clients and creating simple treatment plans for them. When something happens in a client's life that's going to change the direction of therapy, you want to amend that therapy plan, that treatment plan, by identifying the new problem, the new goal, and the therapeutic intervention that you're going to use, and then note the client's consent to change. And so I often get asked the question, why would you need to change your treatment plan? And it happens. It happens if you think about, something that always pops into my mind that can abruptly change the direction of therapy is the loss of a loved one. Whether it's the ending of a relationship or somebody close to them passes away. And all of a sudden, you need to be incorporating some grief therapy in your work. So you want to make sure that you are noting in, like something that happens in your client's life like that, that's going to change the direction of therapy. You want to amend that therapy plan by identifying the new problem, the new goal, and the therapeutic intervention that you're going to use. And then you want to note the client's consent to the change. Now, if you're working at all with insurance companies or EAPs, you're probably already doing treatment plans that are much more formal than what I've just suggested. What I'm suggesting here is really a get your feet wet approach to treatment plans that can be used when the treatment plan is primarily for use by the therapist only in your notes, okay? Just so you have an idea of what I'm talking about there. So continuing on in this is the biggest section of the clinical records checklist is the therapeutic process. So it talks about, documenting ongoing clinical impressions and observations, professional opinions regarding client status, therapeutic outcomes and or results, and as applicable, the conclusion or termination of the therapeutic relationship, including reasons, and an explanatory note, such as a summary of outcomes or follow-up recommendations. Ongoing clinical impressions and observations and professional opinion. I do this in each of my session notes under a category called client appears. And then what I do from there is I put a note like the client appears sad, tired, and anxious. That's a clinical impression and observation. It's different from a professional opinion. So a professional opinion might be a note such as anxiety may be presently increased due to disrupted sleep patterns that the client has reported. So that's more of an opinion, by saying that the anxiety may be presently increased because of, this or that is going on. Okay, so that just to give you an idea of a difference between an impression or an observation versus a professional opinion. And you want to make sure that you're recording both of those in your notes. Therapeutic outcomes or results. And this is identifying the benefit for clients as a result of therapy. And the outcomes should relate directly to the goals in the treatment plan. Progress towards those outcomes should be documented as well. Even, when that progress is small, still document it, note it. Because you really want to be documenting the change that is happening for your clients. And sometimes progress happens quickly and happens in leaps and bounds, but oftentimes progress is small, it's gradual. And so, look for progress as you're working with your clients and make a note about it in your session notes. Now, the conclusion or termination of the therapeutic relationship really could be better referred to as discharging your clients. And discharging your clients either when they reach their goals for therapy or when they stop coming to therapy is required. It's showing up on this checklist. Now, discharging a client from your practice does not mean the client can't come back to see you. What it does mean is that you've formally closed their file, which helps to protect you as a therapist. It also helps you if they come back to wanting to work with you again, say in a year or 2 years, because it gives you the opportunity when they come back to get updated consent forms, updated client profile, and to really check in with them to see about what their goals are for therapy and what has changed. So it's really important that we discharge our clients and kind of follow through with that. And what's interesting to note, and I think you may be picking up on this as we're going through this clinical records checklist, is that there is not a lot of like super clear direction. You have to do it this way from CRPO. And I know that some therapists find that a little bit frustrating because it can feel like it's not clear enough. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that what CRPO is doing is they're giving us flexibility. Okay, they're giving us flexibility to make sure that we're doing each one of these parts in our practices, but they're giving us the flexibility to do it in a way that works for us. And so, how it works for me may not work for you, and that's okay as long as we're both, doing the same thing. So, just for a moment, I'll pick on this, termination of therapy or discharging your clients from therapy. And it's pretty straightforward, when you're working in session with clients and they tell you, oh, I think I've reached my goals. I think I'm pretty good. We can probably wrap this up. And we're able to do that termination or that discharge right while we're in session with clients. Sometimes, though, our clients just stop coming to therapy and we don't have that closing session or that conversation directly with them about ending therapy. And so, what's interesting to note here is that, on the clinical records checklist, as well as in the practice standard, there's no indication from CRPO that we are to terminate or discharge a client after X amount of time. And what that means is that it is up to us to think about, the length of time, that we haven't seen a client. What is that length of time that we haven't seen a client when we think, okay, I should probably discharge them. And so that's up to you. I have lots of conversations with therapists about things like this, and asking and checking in. Well, when should I, and that, and so I'm thinking about some of those conversations, and there's a wide variance. So, some therapists, I have heard of therapists that want to close or discharge a client after a month or two of not seeing them. Other therapists wait 4 to 6 months, and still others wait a year. If I haven't seen a client in a year, I'm going to discharge them. All of this is going to be okay because each of these different scenarios includes the therapist terminating, discharging, closing their files, right? So that, I think, is actually a benefit for us of CRPO not being super specific on how we do this in our practice. It gives us the flexibility to do what feels right for us and our clients, and how we work with our clients. And so, some of these pieces you can actually, think about, well, how do I want to do this? So these are the different pieces that are included on the checklist. That means I need to be doing them, but the how I do them is up to me. And so that's just, my thoughts on that. I wanted to share, some of the common things that come up when I'm talking with people, just so that you have some ideas on that. So we're going to shift now to talking about invoices and receipts. And because this is another super important section of our practices and is sort of in a way included in documentation. And so, billing and receipts, our billings need to include the following type of information: the registrant's legal name, that's your legal name, right? And any alternate name that you use in practice, your professional title, the title that's conferred to you by the college, and your registration number. the amount that's been paid, and the date service was provided. It also needs to include the type of service provided. And so you might be wondering, well, it's psychotherapy, but you can also think about, was it family therapy? Was it couples therapy? Was it individual therapy? Be specific about the type of service provided. You also want to include the full name of the client. If you're registered for HST, your HST number should also be included on any invoices or receipts. It's really important. And your financial records, they can be kept separate from your clinical records, like your chart, your client charts. But they need to have the same regard for security and confidentiality as those clinical records. Now, according to CRPO, financial records must be kept for 5 years from the last interaction or the client's 18th birthday, whichever is later. So, if you are working with children, you're going to need to hang on to those financial records for a lot longer because it's 5 years from the last interaction or 5 years from the client's 18th birthday, whichever is later or longer. Okay. The information that's required to be on invoices and receipts is pretty straightforward. And CRPO expects our invoicing and receipts to be accurate and transparent. It's also expected that we have clear records if we reduce or waive fees, indicating the reason for the reduction or for waiving the fees. Now, if an invoice is being charged to a third party, and this could be, when I say third party, it's someone who's not the client. So it could be, an insurance company, but it could also be a parent if you are working with children. So if a parent or another family member is paying for therapy sessions, somebody other than the client, then that's what would be considered a third party making payment. And so the third party's name and contact information needs to be on the invoice. And if payment is received from a third party, that receipt needs to include the third party's name and contact information. Now, if your clients are paying for their sessions and then submitting that to an insurance company, you don't have to worry about that, okay? Because your financial transaction has happened directly with the client. Okay. Now, something else that is really important to note here is that CRPO's requirements for keeping financial records of 5 years appears to be shorter in some cases than CRA, Canada Revenue Agency's 7-year requirement. So you need to keep this in mind, okay, before you're destroying those financial records too quickly. You may be okay after 5 years to not keep those financial records from CRPO, and it might be a little bit of a problem if CRA comes knocking at your door before 7 years. So keep that in mind. I know as well, I've seen and heard, some people talking about, late cancellations or missed sessions, and how do you invoice or receipt for that? And it's really important, when you are billing for a canceled session or a missed session, that it indicates on the invoice or the receipt that it's for a canceled or missed session. Right? This goes back to being really clear and transparent about what the bill is for, what services were provided. If no service was provided, if a therapy session did not happen, then we need to make sure that that is clear on the invoice or the receipt. Right? That's all about those transparency pieces, and it's super, super important. So I want to just pause here for a moment just to check in and see what questions you might be having as we've been talking about all of this. And so I don't know if you want to raise your hand. I'm not sure that I'll be able to see that. I'm going to see if I'll be able to see that. And then maybe Barbara, you can help me.
I'm happy to help. So far, we don't have any hands raised. Oh, Jessica?
Yes, I'm just curious whether or not um, like, okay, say for example, if you have an accountant or someone who, you know, who takes care of the financial end of things.
Yeah.
Now, what do you do about the client's information for that?
That's a good question. That's a great question, actually. So again, right, this is up to you. I've seen this handled a couple of ways. Some people will have their accountant or bookkeeper sign confidentiality agreements, which is fine, right? To do that, they sign a confidentiality agreement, and that's pretty common legal document that you can have drafted up. Another option that you can do is to what I'll tell you what I do in my practice. I use Jane app as my electronic health record system, and then my bookkeeper has QuickBooks online. And so what I do is I pull a report in Jane, put it into Excel, and I delete the columns that have client identifying information, and then I send that to my accountant and bookkeeper. So they're getting the transactions that are happening on each day, they're getting the amounts, and they have no client identifying information. And
Okay.
they don't have, and they don't have access to my Jane account. So there's no way for them to get any client identifying information. So, I mean, that's one way to do it, but I know that many people have their bookkeepers or accountants sign confidentiality agreements.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sheila?
Yeah, my question has to do with the substitute decision maker, which you said, if applicable. Could you speak a little bit to the if applicable?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sometimes people don't have substitute decision makers, right? They don't have those people in their lives. And so I apologize because I am not going to get this list like absolutely accurate with my memory the way that it is. But you know, there are substitute decision makers such as, you know, a spouse is in a certain spot on that list, or you know, different family members are in different positions on that list. And if they don't have those people in their lives, then it's not really going to apply. But you know, you can think about particularly therapists who work with children, who may or may not be able to give consent or make decisions on their own. Then it becomes really important to be noting those substitute decision makers so that you are speaking with the right people.
Okay. And so is the idea we should be asking that of all clients and then noting if they do not have a substitute decision maker?
That would be best practice for
Okay.
sure, Sheila.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I'm going to post into the chat box a list of substitute decision
Thank
makers
you so
in
much, Barbara.
Ontario, because they do come in a particular order.
Yes, they do.
And healthcare practitioners who are managing that will, you know, if number one is not there, you got to go to number two. If number two is not there, you have to go to number three.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Barbara.
You're welcome. There's a couple questions in the chat box.
Okay, let me look that up here right now. What do you do if your agency or setting has unique documentation standards that might include global consents? Curious as to what that means, global consents. Are you able to tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
All right. I'm using a funky earpiece. So I mean, so for example, intake. So like in a hospital setting where the patient comes in and consent and confidentiality are probably assessed at intake and assessment, maybe with a member of the interdisciplinary team. So for example, with the physicians, with the nurse practitioners, so they sign and then they're entering like group therapy. So it's, you know, so down the line, it's, you know, the documentation is very set, even the documentation of their, you know, engagement with the process is already preset. I really appreciate what you said that, you know, CRPO gives us leeway. So I find in my documentation, I'm actually able to integrate some of those things just in the way I'm writing, following the templates. But there's some areas I've struggled, you know, like I'm not documenting my concerns.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're gonna, especially when you get into like some of the practice standards with CRPO around consent, we do not have the privilege of passing off our responsibility for gathering consent to anybody else. When you read the practice standards around consent, it's really clear that it is our responsibility to ensure informed consent has happened. And so I totally appreciate what you're saying now. Thank you for explaining that, about hospital settings and sort of these global consents that have happened several steps before the person actually gets to talk to you. So, you may not get it in writing, but understand what I said earlier about consent. Explicit consent can also be verbal if you note it. And so, think about your initial conversations that you have with those people and just, having a conversation about consent for therapy and then making sure that you note that and that then becomes your explicit consent. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, it does. It does. And I think it's about keeping track of this guidelines and so sort of building them into my documentation. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. You're welcome. You're welcome. Okay, and then we've got Melanie. Documenting client encounters. Does this also include basic emails about scheduling, or would it more refer to clear examples like a client pausing, discontinuing therapy, sending a meme, etc.? So a great question, Melanie. Thank you for asking it. There has been a lot of debate in conversations that I've had, with different therapists and even with CRPO, with a practice advisory. It's kind of questionable whether you need to document like an email about scheduling an appointment. Hey, do you have any openings on Tuesday next week? And you reply, yes, I've got 2 o'clock available. And they go, great, I'll see you then. That type of encounter doesn't really have to be recorded in our clinical record. But if in there they say, hey, I want to, do you have anything on Tuesday because blah, 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 just happened and I really need to see you. Now that communication is about more than just scheduling. And so then that does need to be included in the clinical record. And so it does also mean like you're talking about in your question here, a client contacting you, say, hey, I'd like to pause therapy, or I'm going to stop coming to therapy, or I saw this great meme, or I saw this news article and made me think blah, blah, blah. And they send that to you. All of that needs to be included in the clinical record according to the documentation standards from CRPO and that clinical record checklist. And that's where, I think like this is one that, maybe some of us are prone to missing this because it may not seem important to us. And we're required to have it in our clinical records. So I hope that answers your question, Melanie. If it doesn't, pop something in the chat or unmute your mic or whatever. Okay. So next question that we have is, when amending treatment plans, is that directly on a single treatment plan, or can it be added to session notes or added to their chart as an updated or new treatment plan? This is a really good question, Simran. Thank you so much for asking this question. So this is getting into the how, right? And the how is where we have some flexibility. So, I'll tell you what I do and why I do it this way, but that doesn't mean you have to do it this way. I do keep my treatment plan document separate from my session notes, always. And that's so that if there's any question, well, what's the treatment plan? I can go to one document and I know what that treatment plan is. If it's in a session note somewhere and I need to try and remember what session it was that we made a change to the treatment plan, I'm just not going to remember. I'm just being honest, right? Like, I'm not going to remember, was that 3 sessions ago or 6 sessions ago? And I just don't want to have to take the time to like go through each session note to try and find that. So for my own brain, I keep my treatment plan separate. And so, you probably could add it to a session note. I keep it separate. And, if I update a treatment plan or I do a new treatment plan, then I just do that and it's kept completely separate. What I will do in my session note is I will note in the session note, discussed changing treatment plan, right? And then I will kind of outline what those changes are. But the actual change to the treatment plan happens in my treatment plan document. I hope that makes sense for you, Simran. And if you have any other questions, let us know.
Can I add one piece to that, Liane?
Sure.
Just because I do it very similarly with one little twist. So we have the treatment plan separate and dated. So treatment plan as of this date, treatment plan of this date. But within the note where we're changing the treatment plan or changing the goals, we're going to do a counseling review. So that's one of our subheadings.
Yeah.
We'll put the treatment plan and we will speak to the expected or hoped for outcomes and what the client reported in terms of change, what we noticed in terms of change. So the clinical information is in the note. And the new treatment plan has that date. So we know where to look. We don't have to remember, but we have full substantive information, and the treatment plans stay pretty simple. So you can access them and read them and track them really easily.
That's great, Barbara. Thank you for sharing that, because as I said, right, there's more than one way to do this and meet the practice standards. And it's really seriously about finding what works for you and doing it in a way that is going to still meet the standards. So yeah, thank you, Barbara, for sharing that. That's fantastic. What are essential documenting requirements for group therapy? So it's the same. There's one clinical record checklist and one documentation standard with CRPO. So there's not any difference with group therapy. Where it does get to be, different is in the how, right? In the how you're documenting, you're going to be documenting it differently if you're doing group therapy as opposed to, family therapy or marriage counseling, as opposed to individual therapy. But those key requirements of, like your record needs to be in chronological order, it needs to include these components. That's the same across the board, no matter, what type of service or type of therapy that you're doing. Next question here is, if the EHR system has categories for type of referral, does it need to be explicitly reinstated, or maybe that means restated in the record? Yeah, if you got, oh, Barbara, you answered that one.
I took a little birdie there and answered that one.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah. If you've added it into the field in your EHR, yes, it's part of your file. It doesn't need to. Yes, you're absolutely right. Okay. Fantastic. Good. Okay. What other questions are there? There's always questions about documentation. So I want to make sure, that I'm giving all of you lots of time.
We have one more question
Yeah.
here, follow up on the group therapy.
Yep. Good
Are
question.
we expected to make notes for every individual or for the group as a whole?
Good question. So again, I use Jane, and so I'll speak to how you can do this in Jane. So you make one note in Jane for your group. If you set the session up as a group in Jane, and you've got all the individuals that are listed in there, you can literally go onto one client's chart, create your note for that group therapy session, and then when you go to sign it, you get a pop-up box that says, do you want this recorded on all of the files? And I say yes. And then I don't have to go into each individual and put that group session note. So, because, again, right, this is about ease of things for my brain. If I had a group and then I, had a group note that was not on each client's record, it would be like, did they come that week or did they not come that week? Where am I looking to find this note? For my own brain and to keep things easy, if I am able to keep that group session note or that group therapy note and have it on everybody who is actually there, and then it's in their chart, then it becomes really easy if they were ever to ask a question about, can I see my file? Can you tell me what sessions, this or that or the other thing happened? So that's how I'm doing it in Jane app. Barbara, do you do groups, or is there anybody else that, does groups that wants to speak to how they record it?
Yeah, we do groups, and we have the clinician who runs the group write an overview of the group process, and that is usually a paragraph or so that goes into each individual person's note. And then we have the other sections where we will do, it can be very brief assessment because we don't use names in our general write-up. And so there's no, if, if Jonathan's file is subpoenaed and he was in a group, and Jonathan's file has every other group member's name in it, we're in a bit of trouble. So we have a very standardized one. It goes across the board, and then each individual file has a quick assessment. And sometimes that's like, no significant risk factors noted, client was clear and emotionally stable. But sometimes one person in a group is very unsettled. And so we're going to speak more directly to that in their file only.
That makes so much sense, Barbara. That's great. Yeah. Does that answer the question about documenting the group therapy, that question that just came up? Let me know if there's anything further that you want to talk about on that.
We have somebody with their hand up, Rima.
Hi, thank you for your answers. It's really helpful. I have a couple of associates, my colleagues, and three of us are planning to run a group, anxiety group. So they won't be our regular clients just coming up for this support group. And I wonder, like all three of us are on Jane now. Under whose name, who of us will have that, those clients, because all three of us are running it. How do we decide who does it? And then there are times when two of us would do it, and there are times when three of us would do it. So it's a little confusing for me. How do I record everything? And then if we have, say, 6 people, then we have 6 new clients entering in Jane and then grouping them. Is this how I go, like I do for family and couples therapy?
I don't do it that way in my Jane system, and like as my family or couples that, connecting the client profiles, I only do that for couples or for family. I would not do that for group therapy.
Okay.
You can set up a group appointment type in your schedule in Jane. So I think really the only spot that you're really going to have to choose which practitioner is when it comes to scheduling the group. You're going to have to put that on somebody's schedule. And
Right.
other than that, if your practitioners, if you have access to see everybody's schedule, if you have 3 therapists that are kind of running the group, and one night or one time that the group meets, one of the therapists isn't there for whatever reason, then, you can assign writing the note to one of the therapists who was there. They can go into that appointment on Jane and they can start to write the note. So any of you could actually write the group therapy note. It would just be, a matter of deciding who's going to take that note and who's going to write that note.
I would also suggest you have consistency. So
Yeah.
all of the notes are under one of the clinicians' names, but within the note itself, you indicate which clinicians were present session by session. So the note's really explicit about who's in the room and who's providing that support.
Thank you. This is really helpful. And what you're suggesting is that there's another facility on Jane which says group appointments. And so I'll enter all the details of each client, each participant in the group there, right? So I don't have to do it like family and couples. That's what you're suggesting, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. This is so helpful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Okay, so we've got the next question here is relating to documenting reasons for lowered or waived fees. If you offer a set number of affordable sessions or sliding scale or similar, is it enough to put affordable session on the invoice? How much detail about the reasoning needs to be documented in the clinical note or on the invoice? So I think it's very different what you're going to do on an invoice as opposed to what you're going to do in your clinical note. So I like that. I like that idea of having, an affordable session, and putting that on the invoice. So, just some simple wording like that can work really well on your, like on the actual invoice or the receipt. And then how much detail or reasoning right? Again, this is getting into the how, and CRPO is not specifying the how. Hooray, because that could be really challenging for some of us or all of us. So the how you do this is up to you. You need to have some detail to be able to explain or justify the reasoning for that different rate. And so, you might write down client is presently unemployed. So you discussed reducing the rate until the client finds another job, or, for the next 2 months, or whatever, you've got on there. So it really doesn't have to be a massive explanation, but it does need to be some sort of explanation that you're keeping in the clinical note. But then keeping it pretty brief, I would think, on the invoice, because you don't want it to be onerous and taking up lots of space on your invoice.
And I have a quick question about that. Is it even required on the invoice? Because the fee that they're being charged is the fee they're being charged.
Yeah.
And for example, an insurer isn't going to care if it's your
No.
fee, if it's a reduced fee.
No, they're not. They're not. That's a really good question, Barbara. I think, if you look at the standard for it, you may be required to do that on an invoice or a receipt, though. So just sort of noting that there is a discount or some type of reduction. So you may need to put it that way, maybe like as I wouldn't use the word discount for therapy, though. That doesn't sit right with me. But something about reduced fee or affordable session, and just putting that on there. I'm pretty sure that that's in the standard, that it does need to be noted on the receipt or the invoice, but definitely like the reasoning for it doesn't need to be on that invoice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Michael Green has his hand up.
Okay.
Thanks, Barbara. I'm just wondering, is there a place that I could look to see types of clinical notes, different styles of clinical notes, or is it just whatever I come up with? Because I've been told different things about clinical notes. Some people said to write a lot, and other people said make it very brief. So I'm not sure. It would be interesting to see different styles of notes. Any thoughts about that?
Oh, I have lots of thoughts about that. Great question. There's, first of all, you're going to be hard pressed to find a lot out there that is really specific to CRPO. I do run some clinical documentation courses myself through Build Your Private Practice around session notes and treatment planning. And those are specific to CRPO because that's who I'm registered with, and that's who, I have to ultimately answer to. But you can Google, sounds terrible, but in a way, you can Google, psychotherapy session notes, and you'll get lots of different examples. Some, I'm thinking like there's SOAP notes, and that is a very kind of standardized way to do your session notes, and, subjective, objective, and I never remember the other two because I don't use that myself, but
Assessment and plan.
Thank you. Right. So there's a few different kind of templates, if you will, that are kind of standard that you can use to do psychotherapy session notes. And again, it's up to you. If you are using a system like Jane, I don't know if Owl has this, but they might. You can go into Jane's template library and like just search the library for a psychotherapy session note templates, and there are tons of them in there. And you can go through and sort of look at, like, okay, what makes sense for me? Like sort of look at what the practice standard says, look at the clinical record checklist, look at the templates, and you can customize and make something that works for you. Is that helpful, or did I confuse you more?
No, that was helpful. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Okay. Let's see here. Michelle is asking, work for multidisciplinary clinic, the clinic pays, or the client pays the clinic invoices the client with the clinic's HST number, your details, yep, then the client pays the clinic. I later invoice the clinic with my own HST number. Is this correct, or does my own HST number also have to be on the client's receipt? That's absolutely correct. Yeah, the way that's happening, the way you described it there is correct, because the client is paying the clinic. And so the HST number on the invoice or the receipt should be the clinic's HST number. And then when you are doing an invoice, you're including your HST number on your invoice. And that's why HST is then payable to you. So yep, you've got that exactly right.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Okay, so Nancy is asking a question here. Can you say a bit more about consent? I understand implicit consent, which we have when the client shows up. I also understand verbal consent, which must be documented, but under what circumstances or what? Just need a bit more clarification about the different forms of consent. So, there's written consent, right? There's the three big ones are, written consent, verbal consent, and then implied consent. And then we've got, this sort of like implied consent and explicit consent. So when consent becomes explicit is when it's in writing, because you have a document that you can show, here's where they gave consent. Verbal consent becomes explicit when we document it. So, when we're talking with a client and, you say something like, okay, is it all right if we now talk about this, or if we now do this? And they say yes. If it's, not something substantial, then, maybe you don't note it in your notes. But if it is something substantial, then you're going to want to note it in your clinical record. And so anytime that you're doing something, kind of major or new, especially when you do something new with a client, you want to be documenting that you asked for consent and that you got consent from the client. If it's something that you've done a bunch of times before with a client and you've got consent before and you've noted that consent, and, I'm talking about, if you were using a specific, say, CBT tool or skill, and, and you said to the client, is it okay if we just revisit this and talk about it again? You may not want or need to note that consent again. And you may want to, just depending on, your style and how you do it. You definitely want to be documenting consent anytime that you're doing something new with your clients. You definitely want to be documenting consent at the beginning of therapy as well. And so I hope this is sort of differentiating for you, the differences between explicit and implicit consent, and documenting those things.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay. I see compassionate pricing with a question mark after it, so I'm not sure if that's a question per se.
It's a suggestion for another way of wording on the.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I'm just looking at this. Okay, let's make sure that we understand this here. Okay. Note designer, yes, also has good templates. There is a cost for it. Yes, absolutely, you're right. All right. In case notes, when documenting emails, if I'm sharing attachments, worksheets, documents we worked on, do I need to put all the attachments in the note, or can I simply reference them and take a screenshot? Yeah, anything that I'm sending to the client, I attach in the clinical note. Oh, Deborah does, or Barbara does the same. Perfect. Yeah, there's a really easy way to actually do that in Jane. You can actually do it through Jane, where you're attaching the worksheets or attachments to the client chart, and then you share that chart note with the client, and they can access it and they have it. So it's like a one and done thing. Like when you're creating it to send to the client, you're also creating it for the chart. And so that helps to save time there as well. All right. Any other questions? Just want to check in. I do have a little bit more that I want to talk about, but I just want to check in about questions. I want to make sure we've got lots of time. Anything to consider on invoices when someone else is giving consent to pay for the client. Parent, caregiver, power of attorney. I'm presuming POA means power of attorney. That's what jumps into my brain. Anything else, anything to consider on the invoice? I think, yeah, I mean, the most important things are the pieces that have to be on the invoice. And then, just thinking about, I don't know if you have extra information on your invoices, but just being mindful of, what else is on there and making sure that it's not breaching client confidentiality. And I can't really think of anything that you would be putting on an invoice that's kind of standard, that would happen. What about you, Barbara? Can you think of anything else?
No.
No. Okay. Okay. Fantastic. All right. Well, if there are more questions, put them in the chat. I'm happy to continue talking about this. And in the next few moments, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Build Your Private Practice and what I do there. We have 3 main programs. We have a program called Launch Your Practice, which is exactly what it says. This is for people who are looking to launch their private practice. It's all about getting ready to launch that private practice and then actually doing it. It's a 3-month program. And our second program that we have is called Grow Your Practice, and that's about marketing and running your practice with ease and confidence. It's really, growing it from, the beginning to being a nice full practice. And then the third one is Scale Your Practice, and that's a 6-month coaching program that we have as well. And all of our programs include onboarding, curriculum with instructional videos and downloads, on-demand community support, weekly group coaching calls. There's a whole library full of resources and accountability partners. And so that is all included. And then our Scale Your Practice program also includes private strategy sessions, half-day live annual planning sessions, live quarterly planning sessions. We've got quarterly mastermind sessions and live monthly team meetings and weekly Q&A sessions. And so there's a lot going on over at Build Your Private Practice, and the website is buildyourprivatepractice.ca. And the reason I'm mentioning this tonight is I've been talking with Barbara before we put this series together. She's got a lovely program, and Barbara, if I butcher this name, please correct me. Kutama Wema.
Great. Kutana Wema, you got it.
Thank you. Thank you. And so, in doing this with Barbara tonight, I have let her know that, I wanted to talk a little bit for just a few minutes about the different programs that Build Your Private Practice has. And what we're doing is people who sign up for the programs through this webinar series. So whether it's tonight or through any of the upcoming 4 seminars, a portion of the proceeds are going to go to Barbara's program. And so, Barbara, I would love it if you took a couple of minutes here and just talked about your program and, why it's important that we're, getting some funding for this program for you.
Really happy to talk about Kutana Wema. Redbird Therapy partnered with an agency in Mombasa, Kenya called Wema Center, and they rescue, rehabilitate, and reintegrate street-connected kids. And they serve 150 children at any given time from ages 3 up to going off to university. It's a program that's been around for decades. It is solid, incredible trauma treatment foundation in the work that they do. And they invited us to partner with them to do a knowledge share program. So it has a few components. The highlight of it is that we take a group of folks each year, once a year in January, and we spend an intensive week with the staff, the outreach workers, the counselors, the house mothers, the kids at Wema Center, learning from them about how they do their program. And we bring, depending on who comes, what our skills are, what our expertise is, and provide some support in that way. And so it's this really dynamic, every year is a little bit different based on who comes along. This year we have a mom who is a lawyer, family law lawyer, and her 7-year-old son. So that's exciting. It's new for us to have a kid in our group. it is, for those who are registered as RPs, it certainly would count as a continuing education program. And it would absolutely be accessible as a business expense. So just so you know, we do this really intensive weekend. Then for those who choose to, you can stay and do an integration retreat, and we go on safari in the Masai Mara. And it is really an incredible 2 weeks of going deep with ourselves and in relationship across a lot of cultural differences, but with this central piece about learning from each other. So that's coming up soon. You can follow us on our social media. We start Jan 21st, I think, this year. And in 2025, it'll be in early January, January 5th, 4th to 15th. And the second part of the Kutana Wema program is an international trauma peer consultation. And we host 2 of them, one in June and one in September. And Wema and Redbird also host that. It's free. We host it on Zoom, and it's a bunch of folks who are doing trauma work, talking about our work in our respective environments, so we can really learn from each other. One of the things that the staff there said is they have very limited resources in terms of educational opportunities and in terms of support for themselves. So this is really designed as a way to make the circle larger. And we've been really lucky. We've had people from Kenya and Bangladesh and Caribbean Islands. And so really, it's an exciting piece to be in, and it's just a kind of goodwill exchange. So we do that, and we do have a third component to the program where seasoned trauma therapists here in Canada or the US volunteer some time, and they work one-on-one as peer support for the counseling staff, not just at the Wema Center, but we have a couple other agencies in Mombasa who serves, one agency, Okawasasa, serves sexual violence survivors, and Onesmus works with boys and young men. And so they just don't have resources or access to counseling. They don't have resources for educational opportunities for themselves. And this is a way of meeting as peers and talking about the work. So that's what Kutana Wema is in whole, and we would love to have people come along. We do offer subsidized spots for folks who might be have less financial capacity to come, and any of the money that comes to us through your program here, Liane, for folks who sign up with you, that will go directly into our donation to Wema and for the subsidies. So it's a real, it's a win-win. You work with Liane and you get to learn a whole lot, and you're going to be doing some really good stuff internationally. So thank you.
Yeah, and I can't think of, really a better program to support than, the work that you're doing, Barbara. So we're thrilled to be able to partner with you and support you in this way. Okay, so I'm just gonna check in one last time if there are any last questions that have come up around, the topic that we've been discussing this evening, or if maybe you have a question for Barbara about her program. Totally open. I'm sure Barbara I know she can talk for a long time about her
I
program.
can't, it's too exciting. But there is another question, which is really great.
Okay.
We have this question: are you aware of any HIPAA CRPO approved websites or platforms that can be used for scheduling?
So CRPO doesn't approve things. So there's that. In terms of using, I'm presuming you're talking all about online scheduling. I would suggest, sticking with an electronic health record system, such as, the Owls and Janes of our world. I think New Talk is also, I'm pretty sure they're also Canadian. So looking at, you know, kind of Canadian companies that are committed to abiding by, you know, PIPEDA and PIHIPA, all those Canadian pieces that we need to really be adhering to. So that would be my suggestion for that. If you want to go look at a different platform, then you're going to want to really do your research in making sure that they are making, you know, they are reaching those commitments as well. So I hope that's helpful. Any other thoughts on that one, Barbara?
No. Yeah, that was great. What's funny, my experience in this is that we walk in this land between needing to meet a lot of requirements from CRPO and CRPO not giving us a lot of direction on how
Exactly.
those
Yeah.
requirements.
Yes.
And so this, you know, conversations like this, the questions tonight, which were amazing, and Liane, your insight and the research you have done is spectacular, and so incredible of you to offer it to all of us tonight. I just can't thank you enough.
Oh, it has been my pleasure. I'm just seeing some amazing comments in the chat thanking us for tonight. And thank you. It's really been an honor and a pleasure to spend this time with you. And I am back in March, right, Barbara?
Yep.
Yep, I'm back in March. So, you know, hopefully I'll
Exactly.
see some of you again.
Yeah, and in terms of this, the private practice essentials, the second one will be with Anne Rogerson, sorry, and she is going to talk about social media and creating platforms that are in line with your way of doing therapy and what feels like it has good integrity, and what are the clinical considerations we need to think about in our social media use. And then Liane, you're going to be back. We have David and Kyle who are going to come and talk about money and incorporating or not, and investing or not, and how you really think through the financial pieces. And then Lisa will be our last person, and she's been my own coach in terms of doing group practice. And she has an incredible group practice program helping folks think through, is this a path I want to take? And if I do, what does that look like? Because there are so many clinical considerations, legal considerations when you look at moving towards a group practice. So that's going to be the 5. We hope you will come and join us. But Liane, you're going to be 1 and 3.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again tonight, everybody. This has been wonderful. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of your evenings.